The pen was already moving when the door opened. Brett didn't even look up. He was mid-laugh, tilted back in that leather chair like he owned it, signing his name across the divorce papers with the kind of energy you'd use to autograph a fan's shirt. His lawyer was chuckling too. Something about a golf game next weekend. Callie stood on the other side of the desk, pen in her hand, eyes on the door. She already knew who was walking in. Brett didn't. That was the whole point. The laughter died before it finished leaving his mouth. I watched it happen from my chair against the wall. Watched the color drain from his face the second he looked up and saw the man standing in the doorway in a charcoal gray suit, filling the frame like he'd been there 1,000 times before. He had. Frank Harmon owned this building. I should back up. My name is Dana Price. I've been Callie's best friend since the 7th grade, when she let me copy her math homework and never told a soul. 22 years later, she called me at 6 in the morning, voice completely flat, and said, "I need you to be there, not as my friend, as a witness." I didn't ask questions. I just showed up. But I need to tell you what led to that room, because none of what happened that morning makes sense without the 3 years that came before it. Callie Harmon, she kept her maiden name professionally. But legally, she'd been Callie Novak since the spring she turned 27. Was not the kind of woman you'd look at and think she needs saving. She was a nurse practitioner at a pediatric clinic in Charlotte, North Carolina. She coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings. She remembered every single one of her patients' birthdays and kept a little notebook in her scrubs pocket just for that purpose. She was also the only daughter of Frank Harmon. Now, if you're from Charlotte, and that name means something. Frank Harmon built Harmon Properties from nothing, started with one rental duplex in his late 30s, scaled it into a commercial real estate portfolio that stretched across 4 states. He wasn't flashy about it. No reality shows, no magazine covers. He drove a 10-year-old Volvo and ate lunch at the same diner on Tryon Street every Thursday. But when Frank Harmon walked into a room, people noticed. Callie didn't talk about him much. I knew there was distance there. Not coldness exactly, more like a door that had been left half open for years, and neither of them quite knew how to push it all the way through. When she brought Brett home the first time, I understood why Frank might have reservations. Brett Novak was good-looking in a way that he clearly thought was enough. Tall, sandy-haired, great handshake, the kind of easy confidence that reads as charm until you've been around it long enough to notice it never actually goes anywhere. He sold commercial insurance, made decent money, talked about making more. He's ambitious, Callie told me that first night over wine. He's something, I said. She laughed and refilled my glass, and I let it go, because she was happy. And for a while, I think she really was. They got married 14 months after they met, at a small ceremony outside Asheville. Frank was there. He walked her down the aisle. He shook Brett's hand. He smiled in every photo. But I stood next to Callie during the reception and watched her father watch Brett work the room. Watch the way Frank's jaw moved when Brett laughed too loud at his own joke. Watch the way Frank's eyes tracked Brett's hand on Callie's back, a little too firm, steering her away from a conversation she was clearly enjoying. Frank didn't say anything that night, and he wouldn't say anything for a long time. The first year of the marriage was fine, from the outside. They bought a house in a nice part of South Charlotte, a 4-bedroom craftsman with a porch swing and a backyard big enough for the dog Brett promised they'd get someday. Callie was working long hours at the clinic. Brett was between firms, he said, just regrouping, figuring out his next move. The dog never happened. The next move took a while. By the second year, I started noticing things. Little things at first. The way Callie would pause before answering simple questions about money, like she was calculating something in her head before she spoke. The way she stopped mentioning Brett's name in her stories unless I asked directly. The way she laughed at something I said one afternoon at brunch and then caught herself, like laughing too freely required permission. I asked her once, straight out, "Are you okay? Like, actually okay?" She stirred her coffee for a long moment. "So, he's going through something," she said. "It's a hard season." I nodded. I didn't push, but I started paying attention. What I pieced together over the following months, partly from things she let slip, partly from a night she showed up at my apartment at 11 p.m. with red eyes and a grocery bag of wine she didn't want to drink alone, was this. Brett had stopped working. Completely. He called it consulting when anyone asked. But there were no clients, no income, no structure to his days. He was spending. On what? Callie couldn't always track. Nice dinners, weekends away that she wasn't invited on, equipment for a podcast he started and abandoned within 6 weeks. He'd gotten access to their joint account when they married, and by the end of year 2, the savings Callie had spent 5 years building were more than half gone. When she brought it up, he had an answer ready every time. The market. A bad investment she'd agreed to that she didn't fully remember agreeing to. And her own spending, which he cataloged with a specificity that made her feel like she was being audited in her own kitchen. He makes me feel crazy, she told me that night on my couch. Not crying, just quiet and tired. Like I'm the one who's bad with money. And I know I'm not, Dana. I've always been good with money. She was. She absolutely was. Have you talked to your dad? I asked. The pause was long enough that I counted to 8 inside my head. Not really, she said, and that changed about 6 months later. I don't know exactly what happened between Callie and Frank. She kept that part close. But something shifted. She started taking his calls. She had dinner with him twice, alone, at his house out near Lake Norman. She came back from those dinners quieter than she left, but in a different way. Not drained quiet, thinking quiet. By the time Brett handed her the divorce papers, slid them across the kitchen counter one Thursday morning, like a permission slip she needed to sign, Callie had already had 3 meetings with a family law attorney. Brett didn't know that. He also didn't know that Callie had spent the previous 4 months carefully, quietly, and very legally moving her personal assets into an account he had no access to. Her financial advisor, a woman named Patricia, who Frank had recommended. He had walked her through every step. Brett filed first, actually. He thought that mattered somehow. Like there was a scoreboard, and going first put him ahead. His attorney was a guy named Cliff, who wore too much cologne and seemed personally offended that Callie's attorney was a woman. The morning I showed up to that conference room on the 14th floor of a building I did not initially realize belonged to Frank Harmon's company, Brett was already in a fantastic mood. He'd ordered coffee for himself and his attorney. Not for Callie, not for me. He was leaning back in his chair, doing something on his phone, grinning at the screen. When Callie walked in, he looked up, looked back down, and said without any particular feeling, "You're late." She was 3 minutes late. She'd been in the hallway, and I'd been with her, and she had not been doing anything except standing very still with her eyes closed for about 90 seconds while I held her coffee. Or she sat down across from him. I sat against the wall. The attorneys started talking. Pages moved across the table. Callie's attorney, whose name was Renee Cole, and who had the energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed this kind of fight, walked Callie through each section in a low, steady voice. Brett signed things without reading them. I watched him do it, just flipping to the signature lines, scrawling his name, sliding the pages back. His attorney, kept trying to slow him down, and Brett kept waving him off. "It's fine, Cliff. I read them last night." He hadn't read them last night. I know this because Callie had been on the phone with Renee until almost midnight, going over a last-minute adjustment. Brett laughed at something his attorney said. Then he laughed at something on his phone. Then he made a comment about the coffee being better than he expected for this part of town, even though this part of town was uptown Charlotte, and the coffee was from a place that charged $9 a cup. Callie's pen was in her hand. She hadn't signed yet. She was watching the door. I knew what she was waiting for. I'd known since the night before, when she texted me a single message. "He's coming. Don't react when he walks in. I need Brett to see your face. Stay normal." I'd practiced in my bathroom mirror that morning, keeping my face neutral. I'm not an actress. It was harder than it sounds. Then the door opened, and Frank Harmon walked in. Frank didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. He walked into that conference room the way a man walks into a room he's been in 100 times. Steady, unhurried, like gravity worked slightly differently around him. He had a leather portfolio under one arm and reading glasses pushed up on his head, and he didn't look at Brett right away. He looked at Callie. She looked back at him. The smallest nod passed between them. Then Frank pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one that had been conspicuously empty since we arrived, the one I'd assumed was just extra seating, and sat down. Brett had gone completely still. The laughter was gone. The phone was face down on the table. His attorney, Cliff, Nate, had straightened up in his chair and was doing that thing men do when they suddenly realize the room has changed. Smoothing his tie, clearing his throat, trying to look like he'd expected this. He hadn't. I could tell. "Frank Harmon," Brett finally said. His voice came out smaller than he probably wanted it to. "Nobody told me you were—" "No," Frank said pleasantly. "They wouldn't have." He set his portfolio on the table and opened it without any drama. Reading glasses came down from his head to his nose. He paged through something while the rest of us waited. Brett looked at Callie. She was looking at her own documents. "What is this?" Brett asked her. Low. The kind of low that used to mean something in their house. I'd heard her describe that voice before. The way he'd drop it when he wanted her to understand something was serious. She turned one of her pages over. Didn't answer. Brett's attorney leaned in close and whispered something. Brett shook his head slightly. Renee Cole, Callie's attorney, cleared her throat and said, "Mr. Novak, if you're ready to continue, there are a few additional documents your attorney should review before we finalize." "Additional documents," Brett repeated. "That's right." He laughed then. Just once, short and sharp, a sound that had no joy in it. "This is a setup." "It's a divorce proceeding," Renee said. Frank looked up from his papers for the first time since sitting down. He looked at Brett the way you look at a math problem, like you're just trying to find where the error is. Brett looked away first. "I need to tell you about the marriage, the real version, not the version Brett would tell you, which involved a lot of language about incompatibility and growing apart, and Callie being emotionally unavailable since she started working longer hours. Not the version Callie performed for her coworkers and her neighbors and her mother-in-law at Christmas, where everything was fine, just busy, just a hard season, the real version. I'm telling it the way Callie told me over the course of about 8 months, in pieces, on porches, and in parking lots, and once in the break room of my office building because she'd driven there on her lunch break and didn't know where else to go. I'm telling it this way because she never sat me down and gave me the whole story at once. It came out the way water comes through a cracked ceiling, slow, then faster, and eventually you can't ignore it anymore. Brett Novak was not a violent man. I want to be clear about that, because I know that's where people's minds go. He never raised a hand. He never threw anything. What he did was quieter than that, harder to name. He managed her. That's the word Callie eventually used, managed, like she was a project he was overseeing, like her role was to perform well, so he looked good. He managed what she spent, not through conversation, and not through any budget they'd built together, but through a system of comments and questions that made her feel she needed to justify purchases. A new pair of scrubs for work would get a raised eyebrow. Lunch out with coworkers would get, "Again? You just did that last week." Over time, she started putting her own money into a secondary account she didn't tell him about. Not to hide it, just to have something that felt like hers without needing to explain it. He managed who she spent time with, and also quietly. He never forbade anything. He just had a way of being in a bad mood on the evenings she had plans, or of saying something right before she left that sat in her chest the whole time she was gone and made it hard to be present. She started canceling things. She told herself it was because she was tired. She cut back on her visits to her father, too. Brett had a whole language for Frank that he deployed carefully, never outright cruel. Just a steady drip of commentary about Frank's money, Frank's opinions, Frank's way of making Callie feel like she couldn't make her own choices. He treats you like a child. He doesn't think you know what you're doing. Don't you want to make your own decisions? This is the particular cruelty of that kind of control. It wears the costume of love. It sounds like concern. It sounds like I just want you to be your own person. Yeah, and when the person saying it is also the person slowly narrowing your world, it's very hard to see clearly. Callie was 30 years old and brilliant, and she could not see clearly for a long time. What broke through was a Tuesday morning in the fall, about 2.5 years into the marriage. She was at work. She had a patient, a 7-year-old girl named Maya, who'd been coming in for 18 months for a respiratory condition. Maya's mom always brought drawings Maya made for Callie. Callie kept them in a folder in her desk. That Tuesday, Maya ran into the exam room ahead of her mother, launched herself at Callie's legs and said, "Miss Callie, I made you a picture of your house." The drawing was a yellow house with a red door and a big sun and 2 stick figures holding hands in the front yard. Callie held that piece of paper for a very long time. Then she went to her car on her lunch break and sat in the parking lot and let herself think a thought she'd been pushing away for months. I am lonely in my own house. She called Frank that night, from the parking lot of a grocery store, engine running, because she didn't want Brett to hear. She said, "Dad, I think I need help." He said, "I know. Tell me what you need." The next few months were the most careful months of Callie's life. She did not confront Brett. She did not change anything visible. She went home every night, made dinner, asked about his day, moved through the house like nothing was shifting underneath her. But things were shifting. She called Frank twice a week, short calls, parked somewhere Brett wasn't. Frank connected her with Patricia, the financial advisor, who was calm and precise and treated Callie like an adult who could handle information, which, after 3 years of Brett, felt remarkable. Here, Patricia walked her through what she owned individually versus jointly. She walked her through what she'd contributed versus what had been spent. She helped Callie understand that the savings account Brett had drained had been funded almost entirely by Callie's income. Callie opened a new account at a different bank, moved her direct deposit. She called Renee Cole, whose name Frank gave her, and had 3 consultations before she signed a retainer. Yes, Renee was matter-of-fact in a way Callie needed. No drama, no hand-holding. Just here is what you're entitled to. Here is what we can document. Here is how we build this. She documented. Quietly, thoroughly, text messages, bank statements, emails where Brett had transferred money, or made financial decisions without telling her. A spreadsheet Patricia helped her build that laid out every significant transaction from the joint account over 3 years, cross-referenced with her pay stubs. She was careful, she was patient, and the whole time Brett had no idea. He actually seemed to be in a good mood those months. Things at home felt smoother, he told his friends. She'd stopped being so difficult about money, so uptight. He made a comment to his mother on a phone call Callie overheard. "I think she's finally relaxing into the marriage." He was wrong about what she was relaxing into. When he handed her the divorce papers that Thursday morning in the kitchen, he was smiling. Not a kind smile. The smile of someone who thinks they've made the first move in a game, and the other player doesn't know the board exists. "I think this is the right call," he said, "for both of us. I want you to have a lawyer look at it before you sign, of course. I want this to be fair." Callie looked at the papers. She thought about the folder of Maya's drawings in her desk. She thought about parking lots and whispered phone calls and the spreadsheet with 3 years of her own money accounted for down to the dollar. "Okay," she said. She called Renee from the clinic bathroom 20 minutes later. Renee said, "Perfect. I've been waiting for him to file. Now we can move." Back in the conference room, Frank had finished reviewing whatever he was looking at and had closed his portfolio. He folded his hands on top of it and looked at Brett with an expression that was completely, unnervingly calm. "How much do you think you're walking away with?" Frank asked. Conversational, like he was asking about the weather. Brett looked at his attorney, back at Frank. "I'm not sure that's—" "Callie tells me you're expecting the house," Frank said. "The joint account, the car she's been paying for. We're still negotiating. The house has a lien on it," Frank said. The room went quiet. Brett blinked. "What?" Renee slid a document across the table. Cliff grabbed it before Brett could and started reading. His face changed in a way that told me everything. "What is that?" Brett asked his attorney. Cliff set the paper down carefully. He took off his glasses. He said very quietly, "Brett, we need to take a break. Brett didn't want a break. "What is the lien?" he said, louder than before. His voice had lost that careful, controlled quality, the one Callie had described to me, the low and steady that used to fill a room. Now it was just loud. "Callie, what did you do?" She looked at him for the first time since Frank walked in. Her face was still. Not cold, just still. Like she'd practiced being in this exact moment so many times in her head that actually being in it felt almost slow. "I didn't do anything," she said. "My father did." Brett's jaw tightened. He turned to Frank. You put a lien on our house." "On my daughter's house," Frank said, "that she purchased with her income. That you've been living in for 3 years without contributing to the mortgage." "I contributed 11 months," Frank said. "Out of 37. I have the statements." He didn't produce the statements. He didn't need to. The way he said it, flat, certain, like a man reading from a document he'd already memorized, made it clear there was nothing to argue with. Brett's face had gone from pale to something closer to red. His hand on the table was pressing down hard enough that I could see the tendons in his wrist. Cliff put a hand on Brett's arm. "Let's take 5 minutes." "I don't need 5 minutes, Cliff." "Brett," Cliff's voice was careful. "Take 5 minutes." They went into the hallway. The conference room went quiet enough that I could hear the building's ventilation system. Renee made a note on her legal pad. And Frank poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table, unhurried, like he was sitting in his own kitchen. Callie let out a breath. It was the first time since we'd arrived that I'd seen her body actually release something. Her shoulders came down about an inch. She set her pen on the table and pressed her hands flat against her thighs. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded. Then she shook her head. Then she gave me a look that meant both, at the same time. And I don't have words for it. I understood. Frank looked at his daughter. "You don't have to be here for the rest of it," he said. "Renee can handle whatever comes next." "I know," Callie said. "I want to be here." He nodded once. That was enough between them. I thought about the distance Callie had described, the years of half-open doors and careful conversations, and Brett's slow, patient work of convincing her that her father saw her as someone who couldn't handle her own life. Sitting in that room, watching Frank Harmon simply show up, I understood something about what those years of distance had actually cost her. Not Frank's money, not his connections or his buildings, or the lien he'd quietly placed on a house to protect what was his daughter's. Just this, his presence, the specific way a parent can walk into a room and make the thing that was terrifying feel manageable. She'd been without that for 3 years. Brett had made sure of it. They came back in 8 minutes. Cliff had clearly spent those 8 minutes explaining something to Brett that Brett did not want to hear, because Brett sat down with the particular stiffness of a man who has been told to control himself and is actively resenting the instruction. "We'd like to understand the full scope of the lien," Cliff said, professional again, attorney voice back in place. Renee walked them through it. Frank had placed a formal lien on the property 14 weeks earlier, well before Brett filed for divorce, which mattered legally. The lien represented a loan Frank had made to Callie, documented and recorded through proper legal channels, for the original down payment on the house 3 years ago. A loan that had always existed on paper. A loan that Brett, apparently, had never thought to look for. "The down payment," Brett said slowly. $112,000, Renee said. Brett turned to look at Callie. Something was moving behind his eyes. I could see him working backward through 3 years of assumptions, recalculating. "You told me that was your savings," he said. "It was a loan for my father," she said. "I told you my family helped with the down payment. You didn't ask for details." That was true. I knew it was true because Callie had told me, years ago, about the down payment. She'd mentioned Frank helped. Brett had heard, helped, and filed it away as a gift, and moved on, because Brett was not the kind of man who asked questions when the answers might complicate his plans. "So the house," Brett started, "has a $112,000 lien against it," Renee said, "which would need to be satisfied before any equity could be distributed in a settlement." "How much equity is there?" Renee looked at her papers. After the lien and the current mortgage balance? Approximately $14,000. Brett stared at her. 14, he repeated. Approximately. He'd been planning to walk away with what he thought was $160,000 in home equity. I knew this because Callie had found the notes on his phone. She'd told me about them the week before, voice completely flat, like she was reading a weather report. He had actually written down what he expected to get, like a shopping list: the house, the car, half the joint account. He hadn't counted on the joint account being mostly empty, spent down over 3 years, primarily by him. He hadn't counted on Callie's new account, which held her last 4 months of income and was entirely hers. And he hadn't counted on the lien. He looked at Frank. Frank looked back at him without expression. "You planned this," Brett said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was more like something occurring to him out loud. "I protected my daughter," Frank said. "There's a difference." When did you—" Brett, Cliff's hand on his arm again. Brett shook it off. He was leaning forward now, and some part of me was watching his body language with my own chest tight, because I'd heard enough from Callie to know what Brett looked like when he felt cornered. What he tended to do with that feeling. "You have been planning this," he said to Callie now. "For how long?" She held his gaze. "Since you handed me papers across our kitchen counter," and smiled. "You were already talking to a lawyer." "Yes." "Your father already—" "Yes, Brett." "So this whole time?" "Yes." Each answer was the same quiet, same pace. Not triumphant, not cold, just clear. The clarity, I realized, of someone who has been confused and gaslit and second-guessed for years, and is simply done with all of that now. Brett sat back in his chair. He looked older, suddenly. The laugh lines around his mouth that I'd always found slightly irritating weren't doing anything now. His face was just a face, tired and recalibrating, and not sure what expression to land on. "So, what am I walking away with?" he said. It wasn't really a question, but Renee answered it anyway. The answer was, not much. The house equity, minus the lien, was $14,000 to split, 7 each. The joint account had a balance of just under $3,000, also to split. The car Callie drove was in her name alone, always had been. The car Brett drove was leased, in his name, with 8 months left on the term. His attorney had apparently already negotiated away his right to claim a portion of Callie's future income, because the marriage had been short enough, and Brett's lack of contribution was documented thoroughly enough that any claim for support would have been difficult to defend. He'd filed expecting to win. He'd walked in expecting to sign papers and collect. He was walking away with $3,500 and a leased car he'd have to return in 8 months. Cliff was making notes. Brett was not making notes. Brett was doing that thing where you look at a fixed point in the middle distance, because looking at any actual person in the room feels like too much. Frank had not said anything since his last exchange with Brett. He was reviewing something in his portfolio again, glasses on. I'm completely unbothered, like a man who had finished the part of the meeting that required his attention and was now just waiting politely for the rest of it to conclude. That detail, the patience of it, the absolute absence of performance, was somehow the most devastating thing in the room. Brett was performing the whole time, even now. Even in defeat, his jaw was set in a particular way, his posture arranged to look like he was taking this in stride. And he was composing the version of this he'd tell people later. Frank was just sitting there, because Frank had nothing to prove. I thought about Callie telling me once, long before all of this, back when things were still good enough that she could say it lightly, that being around Brett sometimes felt like being in a play, where everyone knew their lines except her. Looking at Brett now, I understood what she meant. He had spent 3 years making her feel like the problem. Like she was the one who didn't understand money, didn't understand relationships, didn't understand how to be a good partner. He had been so convincing about it, so consistent, so patient in the way that only people with long-term plans are patient. And the whole time the real problem had been sitting in his own reflection, which he'd never once been curious enough to look at. Renee slid the final set of documents across to Brett. "These reflect the updated terms," she said. Take as much time as you need." Brett looked at the papers. Then he looked at Callie. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked. Quiet again. The low voice. But it didn't have the same weight anymore. Something had shifted in it. Less control. More just tiredness. Callie thought about it for a moment. Genuinely thought about it. Which I respected. "I wanted a marriage, Ma," she said. "This is just what's left." Brett picked up the pen. His attorney said something low. Brett nodded without really listening. He signed. No laughter this time. The meeting ended without ceremony. Renee collected the signed documents and stacked them with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Cliff packed his briefcase. There was no handshaking. Brett stood up, buttoned his jacket, a gesture that looked like habit more than anything else, and walked to the door without looking at anyone. He stopped in the doorway. "I don't know what I expected. Yeah, some final thing. Some last attempt at the low voice. The controlled exit line." Brett was good at exit lines. He'd had one ready for every argument Callie had described to me. Always the thing that landed last. That she'd be turning over in her head at 2 a.m. while he slept fine. But he just stood there for a second, his back to the room. Then he left. The door didn't slam. It just clicked shut, quiet and final. And that was somehow worse than anything dramatic would have been. Callie stared at the closed door for a moment. I watched her throat move. Cliff gathered the last of his things and excused himself with a murmured something to Renee. Professional to the end, even though his client had just walked out without acknowledging him. And then it was just the four of us. Me, Callie, Frank, and Renee. Renee said, "I'll file these today. You should have confirmation within the week." She looked at Callie with the specific warmth of someone who keeps it professional until the work is done. "You did well." Callie nodded. Her eyes were bright but dry. Renee shook Frank's hand, nodded to me, and left. The room felt suddenly very large. Frank stood up slowly. He moved more carefully than he used to, I noticed. He was in his late 60s, still sharp-looking. But there was something in the way he rose from the chair that reminded you he wasn't young. He picked up his portfolio and tucked it under his arm and looked at his daughter. "Hungry?" he said. Callie let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "Yeah," she said. "Actually, yeah. There's a place on Tryon I like." "Yeah, you've been." "The diner." "The diner." She stood up, and I watched her gather her bag and her copy of the documents. And I watched her father wait for her without rushing her. And I thought about the phone calls in parking lots, and the careful, quiet months, and all the distance Brett had built, brick by brick, between these two people. It had taken 3 years to build. It had taken one morning to start coming down. We went to the diner. Now, it was the kind of place that had been in the same location for 30 years and hadn't updated much. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, a counter with spinning stools, a smell of coffee that had been brewing since before any of us arrived. Frank knew the woman at the hostess stand by name. She called him Mr. H and brought us to a corner booth without being asked. Yeah, I ordered eggs and toast because it was still technically morning and my body hadn't caught up to the emotional weight of the last 2 hours. Callie got a BLT, which seemed both surprising and completely right. Frank got oatmeal and black coffee and unfolded a paper napkin across his lap with the same unhurried precision. He did everything. For a while, nobody said much. We just ate. Then Frank looked at Callie and said, "You held up." "I was terrified," she said. "I know." "You held up anyway." She looked at her plate. "When he asked me if this was what I wanted," she paused. "I almost said no. Not because I wanted to stay. Just because, I don't know. It still feels like losing something." Frank nodded. He didn't rush to fix that. Didn't tell her she hadn't lost anything, or that she'd won, or any of the things people say when they're uncomfortable with someone sitting in grief for a minute. He just nodded. "It is a loss," he said, "even when leaving is right." Both things are true. Callie looked at him. Something moved across her face that I didn't feel like I was supposed to name. "I should have called you sooner," she said. Frank wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "You called when you could." He told me you thought I was. I know what he told you. I believed him. For a while. I know that too. She was quiet. Then, weren't you angry? That I stayed away? Frank looked out the diner window at Tryon Street, the mid-morning foot traffic, a delivery truck double-parked, pigeons doing their pigeon business on the sidewalk. He looked at it all for a moment, like he was deciding something. I was scared, he said. That's different from angry. Callie set down her sandwich. I watched you disappear, he said, still looking out the window. Little by little. The calls got shorter. The visits stopped. You started sounding careful when we talked, like you were choosing each word. I knew what that meant. He paused. I didn't know how to reach you without pushing you further away, so I waited. 3 years, she said. 3 years. The word sat there between them, both of them breathing it. I focused very hard on my eggs. I'm sorry, Callie said. Don't be sorry, Frank said. Just don't disappear again. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. I excused myself to go to the bathroom, which I did not actually need to use. I just stood in the little hallway near the restrooms for a couple of minutes and looked at the framed photos of Charlotte's skyline from various decades and let them have that. When I came back, the energy at the table had shifted, lighter, the way air feels after a storm passes. Frank was telling a story about a contractor who'd tried to overcharge him on a roofing job in the 90s, and Callie was laughing, real laughing, the kind that makes your eyes crinkle. Yeah, I slid back into the booth, and Frank included me in the story without skipping a beat. And for a while it was just 3 people having a late breakfast, and the morning felt almost ordinary. Almost. Because here is the thing about watching someone you love go through something hard and come out the other side. There is always a moment, usually quiet, usually small, when you see that they're still themselves, still the specific person they were before things got hard. And that moment does something to your chest that's difficult to describe. Not sadness, not quite relief. Something in between that doesn't have a clean word. I had that moment watching Callie laugh at her father's contractor story. She was still Callie. The 3 years hadn't taken that, but I'd be leaving something out if I stopped there. Because the afternoon of the day Brett signed those papers, something happened that none of us had planned for. Yet Callie and I had gone back to her house, the Craftsman with the porch swing that she would be keeping, lien and all, once the legal process finished. She was going to buy the lien from her father over time, proper payments, her idea, and Frank had agreed to it because Callie had insisted on it. She wanted it to be hers, earned, not given. We were on the porch, tea going cold on the railing, neither of us talking much, when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her face changed. "What?" I said. She turned the phone around so I could see the screen. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. No name saved. It said, "You think you won. You don't know what I know. I was there the whole time." I felt something cold move through me. "Who is that?" I asked. Callie shook her head slowly. "I don't know the number. Could be Brett." "It's not Brett's number." We looked at each other. "Could be a wrong number," I said. "Or someone trying to—" "Dana." She held the phone up again. I was there the whole time. Someone was watching. Her voice was steady, but her hand wasn't. I looked at the text again. Then I looked at the street. The quiet, residential street with its oak trees and its parked cars and its ordinary Wednesday afternoon. And something at the back of my neck prickled. I was there the whole time. What did that mean? There where? In the building? At the meeting? Or somewhere before that? In the marriage? And in the careful, quiet months when Callie was building her case and moving her accounts and parking in grocery store lots to call her father? Had Brett known more than he showed? Or was this someone else entirely? Callie's phone buzzed again. A second message from the same number. "Ask your father what he did in Raleigh." Callie stared at the phone. I watched her read the message 3 times. I know it was 3 because I counted, not intentionally. It's just the way you count things when your brain is trying to find something to hold on to. "Ask your father what he did in Raleigh." "Call Frank," I said. "I don't want to call Frank." "Callie, I just got him back." Her voice was quiet. I need a minute before I make that call. I understood that. I did. So I sat with her on the porch, while her tea went completely cold, and the oak trees did their slow afternoon thing, and the street stayed ordinary and unhelpful. She didn't call Frank. She called Renee. Renee picked up on the second ring, which told me she was the kind of attorney who stayed close to her phone on the days her cases finalized. Callie put her on speaker and read both messages out loud. There was a brief pause. "Forward them to me right now," Renee said. "Both of them. Don't respond." "Do you think it's Brett?" "I think it doesn't matter who it is until we know more. Forward them and sit tight." Another pause. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine," Callie said. Renee made a sound that was not quite agreement. "Forward the messages. I'll call you within the hour." She hung up. Callie forwarded the texts and set her phone face down on the porch railing. We sat. A neighbor's kid rode a bike past the house, slow and wobbly, training wheels clicking against the pavement. Normal afternoon sounds, a dog somewhere down the block, the refrigeration unit on an HVAC system cycling on. "What did he do in Raleigh?" I asked, carefully. "I don't know," Callie said. "Well, my dad has property there. Has for years. Commercial stuff mostly." She picked up her tea, remembered it was cold, set it back down. "He spent a lot of time there when I was in college. I never really asked why. But you're thinking something." She looked at me sideways. "I'm trying not to." "Callie. Dana." She turned to face me. Her eyes were tired in a specific way, not sleepy, just full. Like she'd been carrying something all day that she hadn't put down yet. "No, I just sat in a room and watched my marriage end. I watched the man I spent 3 years of my life with sign papers and walk out a door. And then I had the best breakfast I've had in years with my father, and I laughed at a story about a roofer, and I felt, for about 2 hours, like things were going to be okay." She exhaled. "I need those 2 hours to have been real before I find out they weren't." I didn't say anything. Because she was right. Those 2 hours were real. Whatever came next. They had happened. Nobody could reach back and take them. "They were real," I said. She nodded. Looked back at the street. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Renee called back in 40 minutes. Not an hour. That alone told me something. Callie picked up and listened. Her face was careful, that practiced stillness again, the one she'd worn in the conference room. I could only hear Renee's voice as a murmur through the phone. Callie said, "How long have you known?" Murmur. "Does he know that you know?" Murmur. "Okay." Long pause. "Okay, yeah. I'll call him." She hung up. She sat with the phone in her lap for a moment. "Tell me," I said. She looked at the oak tree in her front yard. A squirrel was doing something frantic in its upper branches. She watched it for a second, like it was the most important thing happening. "The number that texted me," she said. "Renee had someone run it. It's registered to a woman named Patrice Odom." She paused. She works for my father. She has for about 11 years. She's his property manager for the Raleigh portfolio." I processed that. "So she works for Frank," I said. "And she's texting you to ask about Frank." "Yeah. Why?" Callie was quiet for long enough that the squirrel finished whatever it was doing and disappeared into the leaves. "Renee thinks," she said slowly, "that Brett found her. That he reached out to her, or someone on his team did, looking for something to use. Some kind of leverage." She turned the phone over in her hands. "Renee thinks Patrice got cold feet, or a conscience, or both, and instead of giving Brett whatever he was looking for, she sent it to me." I stared at her. "Brett was digging up dirt on your father." "Looks like it," while sitting in that conference room laughing. "He filed the divorce 3 weeks ago," Callie said. "He's had time." I thought about Brett at that table, the laugh, the phone face down. He's signing things without reading them, because he thought he already knew what they said. He hadn't been just confident. He'd been waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. "He thought he had an ace," I said. "And it didn't show up in time." "What is it?" I asked. "What was he looking for in Raleigh?" Callie set the phone down on the railing again. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs, the way she'd done in the conference room. Reset breath. My dad bought a building in Raleigh about 12 years ago, she said. Commercial property, mixed use. He converted the upper floors into affordable housing units, rent-controlled, income-qualified tenants. She paused. There was a tenant dispute about 8 years ago, a family that was facing eviction, wrongfully, as it turned out. My dad's property management company at the time made an error, misapplied some payments, and the family got an eviction notice they shouldn't have gotten. She stopped. What happened? I asked. My dad found out about it, personally, not through his team. Someone called him directly. He intervened, reversed the eviction, audited the whole management company, fired the people responsible, and paid the family 6 months of rent as an apology. She looked at me. He also paid their legal fees, because they'd hired an attorney by the time he found out. I waited. The family's name was Odom, Callie said. The squirrel was back. I didn't look at it. Patrice, I said. Her parents. She was in college at the time. Her mom called my dad directly because she didn't know what else to do. Callie's voice was very even. He fixed it, and then he hired Patrice 3 years later when she graduated because she reached out and asked if there were any openings, and he remembered her family. I sat with that for a moment. Brett found this, I said slowly. Yeah, some version of this. The eviction dispute, maybe the settlement, maybe just enough to make it look bad without the context. That's what Renee thinks. A wrongful eviction that got settled quietly. Out of context, it sounds like a cover-up. Like Frank Harmon pushed a family out of their home and paid them off. Callie shook her head. He was going to use it in the proceedings, or leak it. Make it look like my dad had something to hide. But Patrice knew the real story. Patrice knew the real story. And she warned you. She warned me. The afternoon light had shifted while we were talking, longer and lower now, coming through the oak leaves in that specific late-day way that makes everything look slightly gold. The porch swing moved a little in the breeze, even though neither of us was sitting in it. I thought about Brett in that conference room, and the way he'd signed those papers without reading them. The way he'd said this is a setup, like he was the one who'd been wronged. He'd had a plan. A whole separate plan. And it had failed before the meeting even started. Failed because a woman whose parents Frank Harmon had treated with basic decency 12 years ago had decided that loyalty ran in a particular direction. Brett had spent 3 years building leverage against Callie. He'd spent 3 weeks trying to build leverage against her father. He'd underestimated both of them. Callie called Frank that evening. I was in the kitchen making pasta. I'd offered to stay for dinner, and she'd said yes without hesitating, which is how I knew she didn't want to be alone with it yet. I could hear her on the porch, her voice low, the swing creaking occasionally. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't try to. The call lasted 22 minutes. I know because I was watching the pasta water and tracking time in the absent way you do when you're trying not to eavesdrop. When she came back inside, her eyes were red, but her face was clear, like she'd cried, and it had been useful rather than awful. He knew she might reach out, Callie said. Patrice. He'd already called her after the meeting. Apparently, she'd called him first, telling him what Brett's people had been asking her about. He told her to trust her conscience. She sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't tell me because he didn't want me going into that meeting carrying it. He was protecting you. He was protecting me. She said it without resentment, just identifying it. He has a whole system of people out there who he's treated right over 30 years. And Brett walked into that and started pulling threads, thinking he'd find something dirty. She shook her head slowly. Nah, he found the opposite. I stirred the pasta. The kitchen smelled like garlic and something close to normal. What happens now? I asked. Renee is documenting everything Brett's people did. The outreach to Patrice, the questions they asked, whether it rises to anything legally, she's not sure yet. She folded her hands on the table. Probably not. Probably he just tried to find dirt and failed. Is that enough? I asked. For you, I mean. She thought about it. Chal, he walked out of that room with $3,500 and a lease he can't afford, she said. And whatever story he tells himself about it, he knows what really happened. She looked at her hands. Yeah, I think that's enough. The pasta boiled over slightly. I turned the heat down, and we both pretended not to notice. "I just keep thinking about that text," she said. "You don't know what I know. I was there the whole time." She almost smiled. She was. Yeah, she was there the whole time. Watching what my dad actually did, how he actually treated people. And when Brett came looking for a weapon, that's what she had to give him. She paused. The truth. I drained the pasta, found a jar of sauce in the cabinet, a dusty box of Parmesan in the fridge. "Brett's whole strategy," I said, "was betting that your dad had something to hide." "Yeah. And your dad's whole life was the evidence that he didn't." She was quiet for a moment. "I wasted 3 years believing Brett when he told me my father didn't respect me," she said. Her voice didn't break. It was just a fact, laid flat on the table. 3 years of short calls in parking lots and thinking my dad saw me as someone who couldn't handle her own life. She looked up. And the whole time he was just being exactly who he always was, fixing things, treating people right, waiting for me to call. The kitchen was quiet, except for the sauce bubbling on low heat. "You called," I said. "I called," she said. She got up and got bowls from the cabinet, and we made plates and sat at her kitchen table as the light outside went fully gold, and then pink, and then the particular blue-gray of an early evening in fall. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Callie repainted the front door. She'd wanted to since the first month they moved in. Had shown Brett a photo of a deep burgundy red she'd seen on a house 2 streets over. He'd said it was too much, too loud, that it would look like they were trying too hard. She bought the paint on a Saturday morning, came home, changed into old clothes, and did it herself. 2 coats. It took most of the afternoon. I sat on the porch steps and handed her things when she needed them, and didn't help. Because she specifically said she wanted to do it herself. When she finished and stepped back to look, she put her hands on her hips and tilted her head. "Well," I said. "It's exactly right," she said. It was. It looked like the house had been waiting for that door all along. The legal side of things wrapped up the way Renee had said it would, quietly, without drama, without Brett making any further moves. Yeah, whatever he'd been planning with the Raleigh information died when Patrice didn't deliver it. His attorney filed the final paperwork. The decree came through. It was over on paper the same way it had been over in practice for longer than either of them had admitted. Brett moved into an apartment in a part of Charlotte that was fine, but not what he was used to. I know this because Callie's neighbor, a woman named Greta, who missed nothing, had mentioned seeing him loading boxes into a moving truck the weekend after the finalization. Callie received this information, nodded once, and changed the subject. She was good at that now, knowing which things deserved her attention and which ones didn't. Patrice Odom called Callie directly about a month after everything. Callie told me about it over the phone, her voice carrying something warm and slightly amazed. She apologized, Callie said, for the text being cryptic. She said she didn't know how much to say, and she didn't want to put anything incriminating in writing in case Brett's people were watching her communications. "Smart," I said. "Very smart." She said she'd been watching what Brett's investigator was doing for about a week before she decided. She said she kept thinking, "Your dad fixed something for my family when he didn't have to, when nobody would have known if he hadn't. And this man is trying to use that against his daughter." Callie paused. "Oh, she said it wasn't a hard decision once she thought about it that way." "What did you say to her?" "I asked her if she wanted to have lunch sometime. And she said yes. We're going next Thursday." I smiled at my phone. "Your dad's going to love that." "He already does. He cried a little when I told him. Don't tell anyone." "I'm telling everyone." "Dana." "I'm telling everyone, Callie." She laughed. Real laugh, the crinkle eyes kind. And I hadn't heard it enough over the past 3 years, and I was filing every instance away now like something precious. The thing about watching someone come back to themselves is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single morning where they wake up and they're fixed. It's not the moment the divorce is final, or the door is painted, or the first time they laugh without catching themselves. It's slower than that. More ordinary. It happens in small moments that don't feel significant until you add them up and realize that somewhere in the accumulation, the person you were worried about became the person you used to know. I saw it happen with Callie over the months that followed. She started cooking again. Really cooking, not just making food to have made it. She had people over for dinner. She rearranged the living room furniture twice, both times at 10 o'clock at night because she felt like it, and didn't ask anyone's opinion. She signed up for a pottery class that she'd seen advertised for years and never taken because Brett had found a particular way of not quite saying it was a waste of time that had made her feel like it was a waste of time. She was, by her own admission, terrible at pottery. She kept going every week. She called Frank every Sunday, not from parking lots, from her kitchen, usually, while she was making coffee, knit with the burgundy door visible through the front window. She also went back to therapy. She'd stopped going 2 years into the marriage, a fact she mentioned once, and then didn't elaborate on. And I didn't ask, because I could guess. She found a therapist named Dr. Waverly in a small practice in Dilworth, who specialized in exactly the kind of thing Callie had been through. And she went every other week and came home from those appointments quieter in the good way, the thinking quiet way. She didn't talk to me much about what she worked through in those sessions. That was hers. But I noticed the changes the way you notice weather. Not any single moment, just a gradual shift in the atmosphere around her. She stood differently, took up more space in a room. Not loudly. Callie was never loud, but solidly. Like she'd remembered that she was allowed to be exactly where she was. About 4 months after the finalization, Frank invited us both to dinner at his house out near Lake Norman. The house was big, but not showy. A craftsman, actually, not unlike Callie's, just larger and older, sitting on the water with a back deck that looked out over the lake. He'd lived there for 15 years. It smelled like wood smoke and old books and the particular clean air smell of being near water in the fall. He made pot roast, from scratch, low and slow, started that morning. There were roasted potatoes and green beans from a garden he kept in the side yard, and cornbread that came out of a cast-iron skillet he said had belonged to his mother. We ate on the back deck with the lake going dark and silver in front of us, and the first chill of the season in the air, and a string of lights Frank had strung along the railing that threw everything in warm gold. At some point, Frank got up to get more cornbread, and Callie and I sat looking at the water. "Sorry, I almost didn't call him," she said. "That night in the parking lot, I sat in my car for 45 minutes, engine running, kept picking up the phone and putting it down." "What made you do it?" She thought about it. "I was tired," she said. "That's really it. I was just so tired of the weight of it, of managing everything myself, of trying to figure out what was real and what he'd convinced me was real. I needed someone who knew me before." She paused. He picked up on the second ring. "He was waiting," I said. "He was waiting." She smiled at the lake. "He told me later that he'd been picking up his phone for 2 years, hoping it was me. That he'd had to stop himself from calling so many times because he was scared of pushing me further away." She shook her head. 2 years of both of us waiting for the other one to call. "Brett did that," I said. Not a question. "Brett helped," she said carefully. "But I let him. I was the one who believed it." She tucked her feet up under her on the deck chair. "Dr. Waverly says that's not the same as it being my fault. I'm still working on understanding the difference." Frank came back with the cornbread and fresh coffee and settled into his chair with the slow satisfaction of a man exactly where he wanted to be. We sat like that for a long time, 3 people around a table on a deck above a lake, talking about nothing important and everything important, the way you do when you're finally allowed to just exist around each other without anything being managed or performed or held back. At one point, Frank told another contractor story. Different contractor, different city, same energy. And Callie laughed so hard she had to put her coffee down. I thought about that conference room, the laughter that had filled it when we first walked in. Brett tilted back in his chair, certain he was the funniest person in the room. Certain he already knew how the story ended. He'd been laughing at the wrong things. He'd had no idea what was actually funny, what was actually worth anything, what was actually real in that room, and what he'd built entirely out of his own assumptions. This. This deck, this cornbread, this lake, these two people finding their way back to each other. None of this had ever been on his radar. That was the thing about Brett. He'd spent so much energy managing surfaces, what things looked like, yet what story he could tell, how to position himself to win, that he'd completely missed what was underneath. He missed that Callie's quiet was not weakness. It was patience. He missed that Frank's distance was not indifference. It was restraint. He missed that the people he'd underestimated were not waiting to be rescued. They were just waiting for each other. The last time I saw Brett was completely by accident, about 6 months after everything. I was at a coffee shop on South End, waiting for a work call, laptop open, headphones around my neck. He came in with someone, a woman I didn't recognize, laughing at something on his phone. He looked up and saw me. The laugh didn't quite finish. His face did something complicated. Not shame exactly, more like the expression of someone who has practiced a version of events so many times they've almost convinced themselves. Almost. I held his gaze for a second. Then I looked back at my laptop. He ordered his coffee and left without saying anything, and I sat there with my headphones and my work call and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon. And I thought about Callie on her porch with a burgundy door behind her, and Frank's cornbread and a lake going silver in the fall dark. I thought about what it cost to be the kind of man Brett was. Not the money. He'd lost enough of that. I mean the other cost, the one that doesn't show up in any document. So the cost of spending your life managing people instead of knowing them, of being so focused on what you can take that you never notice what you already had. He'd walked out of that conference room with $3,500 and a story he'd spend years getting the details wrong on. Callie walked out with her life back. There's no version of that math where Brett came out ahead. On a Sunday morning in late fall, I drove out to Lake Norman for the kind of visit that had become ordinary now. Easy, unscheduled, just showing up because Callie and I were going to help Frank clean out his garage, and afterward, he was going to make his mother's cornbread again. I pulled into the driveway, and Callie was already there, sitting on the front steps with 2 coffees, one of which she handed me without being asked. The lake was visible through the trees. The morning was cold and clear and the kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. "How are you?" I asked. She wrapped both hands around her cup, looked at the water. "I'm good," she said. Not fine, not getting there. Not the careful, managed answer she'd given me for 3 years when I asked that question. Just good. I believed her. 8 months later, Callie made partner at a new pediatric practice in Charlotte. 3 providers, her name on the door. Frank brought flowers, the good kind from an actual florist, not a grocery store. Patrice came to the small celebration dinner and fit into the table like she'd always had a seat there. The burgundy door is still exactly right. Callie is still bad at pottery. She's still going.